Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name's Amy Stevens, and I'm Chief Executive of Gifted Philanthropy. We're based here in the UK. And I'm joined here by Paul Johnson, who's CEO of Creative Fundraising Advisors in the United States. Thanks for joining us, Paul.
Good morning, good day, everybody. Nice to have you all on our call.
Absolutely. And this is the second of our two webinars on transatlantic fundraising. So last week we were talking about how nonprofits in the US could more effectively fundraise in the UK, Europe, Middle East, and further afield. And today, Paul's going to give us some expert insights into how UK charities can fundraise effectively in the United States, thinking about what considerations we need to have in mind, and also kind of what the global landscape's looking like in the States at the moment. So just to let you know, this is being recorded. It will be available on both our websites in the next few days. So if you've got colleagues that couldn't attend today, but need to catch up, or you need to, dash off to a meeting, you will be able to catch up online. And we'll do questions at the end. So as we go along, please bob anything in the Q&A and we'll pick that up at the end of the slides. But I'll pass to you, Paul, to get us started. So that's us.
That's us. Just in case you were confused as to what we might look like.
I'll
So,
let you get
yeah,
started on the giving stats.
yeah, exactly. And I just before we dive in, I wanted to give everybody some context about giving in the United States. And I think one of the best ways to understand this is to sort of understand the scale and scope of philanthropy in the United States. So every year, there's an organization called the Giving Institute, which is actually a professional organization of fundraising consultants. They partner with the Lilly School of Philanthropy at the University of Indiana, and they do a massive study that is called Giving USA. And Giving USA every year looks at where money is coming from in terms of philanthropy and where it's going to. So, what's interesting is that the new Giving USA numbers were just released this morning. So we don't have, I mean, I have some notes here about how this has changed, but this is 2023 numbers, and they released 2024 numbers this morning. But in 2023, in the United States, $557.16 billion was given away to
Wow.
philanthropy. So when you look at the breakdown of where that money comes from, 60%, 67% of that money, or 370, almost $375 billion, comes from individuals. What's interesting, if you look at that number up there of 8% bequests, $42 billion in bequests, that's also individuals.
Mm.
Um, and then if you look at the foundation number, about 19% coming from foundations. They are mixing together both foundations like the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and sort of those foundations which are driven by boards and foundation officers and whatnot, but also family foundations where those decisions are actually being made by individuals, by families sitting around their kitchen table or their board table, making decisions about what they're going to support.
Yeah.
So about I think it's about half of those foundations are also individuals. So when you add all that up, approximately 90% of the money given away in the United States is coming from individuals in one form or another.
Yeah.
Now, hot off the presses is the number that we have for 2024. And in 2024, $592.5 billion was given away.
Yeah.
So that represents a 6.3% increase over 2023. And it actually represents the most money Americans have ever given away in the history of the United States since this study has been tracked, I think, since the 1970s. It has not yet exceeded, adjusted for inflation, it has not yet exceeded the number, the amount given away in 2021, sort of post-pandemic or in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Adjusted for inflation, it has not exceeded that number. Um, but what's also interesting, and when you see the report come out, individual giving is up by 8.2%. And very surprisingly, corporate giving is up by 9.1%. So if you go to the next slide, Amy, I just want you to show you where the money is going to. Every year after year, without question, the number one category is religion.
Mhm.
Um, and it's interesting that education and human services, so human service organizations are those organizations that we refer to as the sort of social safety net
Yeah.
in the United States. So they usually toggle back and forth between second and third place. Um, and then other categories are gifts to grant making foundations. So this is individuals moving money into their own foundations, public society benefit, health, international affairs, arts and culture, and environment. Um, when you see the 2025 report reporting on 2024 contributions, education, health, arts and culture, and the environment have all seen increases over the previous year, which I think is very encouraging.
It's interesting
Next
isn't
slide.
it? Because it's different to ours, Paul. So in our giving report for last year, our top two categories were health and then children and young people.
Mhm.
So the religion was much further down in ours, even though it is still a big driver. Um,
Yeah, we've had a number of organizations wondering if they should just become churches.
develop
Um, I'm like, it doesn't quite work that way.
a faith ethos, yeah.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Just while we're thinking
Uh,
about the different sectors, have you
yeah,
have you seen any challenges across specific sectors? So, for example, here in the UK, we're seeing, arts, culture, heritage have taken quite a big hit, because, when times are really tough, the money's getting ploughed into health, governmental funding becomes harder to access. Are you seeing any sectors have those same struggles in the States?
absolutely. I mean, even though, I mean, what's really interesting about looking at these numbers, particularly the numbers that came out this morning, is that they're a moment in time, right, from 2024.
Yeah.
Um, 2025 is a very different year than 2024, and there's been a lot that's happened between 2024 and 2025. One of the biggest things that's happened in the United States is all of the uncertainty that is being caused by our current administration's policies around tariffs and around even things like immigration and other things where um, you are seeing dramatic cuts to um, you know government funding of our medical programs, for example, or government funding of the arts, or government funding of just about anything, right? And I think you're seeing that a lot of people or a lot of organizations are expecting philanthropy to sort of fill those gaps.
Yeah.
Um, but the needs on the human services side and on the health side and whatever are so great that I think we're seeing a little bit that arts organizations are making a case for the arts is getting um, it's not impossible, but it's a challenge, right? So how do you make that case for the arts when you literally have people who are losing their healthcare and not able to access services or losing their housing or something like that? So there's a lot of tension right now in those areas. And then the other piece that you've probably heard about in the news is that the US government is cutting a lot of funding to research institutions. And so I think we're going to see I think we're going to see a big influx of private philanthropy into research around medical research and other kind of research where the government has backed off on some of that.
Interesting.
So things are definitely in flux
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah. Yep. So then again, to continue to give you some context, there are 32 different types of what we call nonprofit organizations in the United States, right? And they're categorized under three different that those numbers that you see 501c3, 501c4, and 501c7 are all designations within the United States tax code. And it is within that tax code that you receive this designation, right? And there are very important differences between these three types of organizations. The largest is the 501c3 organization, and that is charitable organizations, religious organizations, education organizations. And the IRS reported that in 2024, there were 1.548 million 501(c)(3)s in the United States, right? So 501(c)(4)s and 501(c)(7)s, the biggest difference between a C3 and a C4 and C7 is that all gifts made to C3s are tax deductible. You can deduct the amount that you've given to those organizations on your income taxes. Gifts given to C4s and C7s are not tax deductible. And that's a very important distinguishing factor. The other big distinguishing factor is that C3s can have no role in lobbying the government for anything. C4s can. C4s have an unlimited role in lobbying government. And C7s are really your fraternities, your sororities, your alumni associations, your private clubs. They also don't get involved in lobbying activities, but they're also not tax deductible. And you can see that there are significantly smaller number of organizations that are classified as C4s or C7s. So in our business, we deal almost entirely with the 501(c)(3) organizations.
See, that's interesting because the C4, sorry, the C7 in the UK, that would be a cask, a community amateur sports club, where you can get tax relief from gifts to that. So that's a notable difference there. So I guess it's super important, isn't it, for UK charities to really understand, what the criteria are and that they're applying to have the right entity when they
Yep.
establish.
And we'll talk about this in a second, but if a UK or European entity is setting up a friends group in the United States, those friends groups are actually considered 501(c)(3)s.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Next slide. So, just a little bit about philanthropy in the US, and this is probably not going to be a surprise to anybody, but philanthropy is a deeply, deeply rooted American tradition that stretches back almost to the founding of this country. It is also something that is constantly evolving. It is not static whatsoever. There are constantly trends in philanthropy. Um, so it's something that if you're interested in philanthropy in the United States, it's something that you really have to keep tabs on in terms of what's happening in philanthropy in the United States. As I said earlier, it's very much driven by individual donors. 90 something percent of the money given away in the United States is driven by individual donors. What we're seeing, and we'll talk about this in a second, is that there's this real concentration of philanthropy right now into fewer gifts at a higher level, or fewer donors that are giving at higher levels. And that is actually a direct result of the changes in the tax code. So there's something in the United States that's called the standard deduction. So when you fill out your tax form, you can take the standard deduction, and you don't have to itemize your deductions. And by they raise the limit on the standard deduction, and so in fact, it you have to give actually quite a bit more to actually not have to be included in that standard deduction. So that is one of the key factors in driving what is happening in individual giving. Also in the United States, and I know that this is emerging or established in the UK, but there's a really well-established development profession in the United States. And philanthropy in the United States for a very long time, for decades and decades, was very much volunteer driven. So boards, committees, whatnot, who were volunteering their time were very active in driving fundraising. I would say in the last probably 30 years or so, that has really begun to shift to professionals working in an organization that are really driving fundraising and really professionalizing this field. The other thing we talk a lot about in the United States is something called the culture of philanthropy, and an institutional culture of philanthropy. And those organizations that have a strong culture of philanthropy are those really are distinguished by having successful fundraising programs. And I could do an entire webinar on what it means to have a strong culture of philanthropy. But a strong culture of philanthropy, by the way we define it, is an institutional understanding, not just an understanding in the development office or the director's office or whatnot, but an institutional understanding that it is philanthropy that actually allows organizations to fulfill their missions, right? Sure, there's earned revenue. Sure, there's other kinds of revenue, but it's philanthropy. We often use the term that funds the margin of excellence for an organization. And so, having a broad institutional understanding of what philanthropy can do for an organization, I think is is deeply embedded in the DNA of most nonprofit organizations in the United States.
That's really interesting. And I think that's something that is is moving in that direction in the UK and Europe, but we need to work harder on for sure. So just touching on the point you made there about the fewer gifts but of a larger amount, we've definitely seen that as well. And really interesting you talked about those kind of tax changes. For us, I think it's largely currently driven by cost of living crisis in that we're
Mm,
people who, could previously give £20 a month just can't do that anymore. But people who can give are giving more and thinking really carefully about who they want to give that to. So we saw a massive shift just after COVID with, let's say a donor gave £1 million a year away, and previously they were splitting that across 5 charities. They started giving it all to their favorite and their pet project, and there were lots of shifts like that. Do you think that's part of it in the US as
for
well?
sure. Yep, absolutely. I think the changes in the tax code are just a part of it. I think there's definitely that is happening for sure as well. Yeah, yeah. So something you may have heard of as well that is happening in the United States is what's called the intergenerational great transfer of wealth. And so it's the transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. It's anticipated that by 2045, about $84 trillion will transfer from one generation to the next. And this is causing major shifts in philanthropy in the United States. I mean, when an estate transfers from one generation to the next. That is what was referred to as a tax event. And in that tax event, because we have estate taxes and whatnot, so in that event of that transfer, there is an opportunity to avoid estate taxes by making philanthropic gifts, right? So it's important to capture that moment, right? But the other thing that we also have to understand is that younger generations um, give differently than their parents give or their grandparents gave, right? And younger generations aren't necessarily, this isn't entirely true, but aren't necessarily um, interested or feel the burden or the responsibility of carrying on their parents' or grandparents' traditions, right? Where I live in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul in Minnesota, there were for decades these very prominent families who built all of the great institutions in the Twin Cities, great orchestras, great theater companies, great universities, great private colleges, all of that. And they built these institutions. Their descendants are now saying, those are built, those are taken care of. We're now going to focus on other things. So they're really looking at, things like the environment are much more important to them. Things like public benefit are much more important to them. And then the other difference that we're seeing in this generational wealth transfer is that this younger generation of donors um, care very, very deeply about impact. And they actually want to see a measurement of impact in their giving. It's not that they don't have a sense of noblesse oblige, because they do, but there's less of a sense of, we're just going to give you your money and trust that you're going to do with it what you say you're going to do with it. They want to form a partnership with you, right? They want to form a partnership with organizations where they really understand um, how their money is being best put to use. They are much more engaged in the life of an organization around their philanthropic gifts. Um, the other thing that we're seeing is a huge rise in the United States of the donor advised fund. A donor advised fund is a moment, it's a taxable event where somebody can move assets from their privately into a holder of a donor advised fund. And that donor advised fund can be held by a brokerage house like Charles Schwab or Fidelity or one of those, but it also can be held by one of our community foundations. And they hold these DAFs, right? And the tax event is actually when that transfer goes from the donor to the holder of the donor advised fund, right? And then the holder of the donor advised fund actually makes the gifts on advice from the donor to organizations. What's interesting about that is we have lots and lots of clients who will receive a check from Fidelity Foundation that comes from a donor advice fund and have no idea who's given that money to them. Because it is an anonymous event when that happens, and that is when the tax event happens. So the organization is not responsible for ensuring that they get a letter saying you've
See,
given this amount
yeah,
and you can deduct it on your taxes and all of that. So there's a lot of anonymity around donor advice funds. There's also a lot of rules around donor advice funds in terms of what they can pay for and what they can't pay for. Um, but it's really interesting. Between 2014 and 2023, the amount of money being held by DAFs went from $70 billion to $250 billion. Part of the problem with donor advice funds, too, is that you make that transfer to a donor advice fund, and then you're under no obligation to actually make the gifts to organizations. It can just sit in the donor advice fund. And so I know that when the pandemic happened in 2020, there was a big movement in the United States called Empty the Funds, where they people were really encouraging um, holders of donor advised funds to spend that money. They've already received their tax deduction, and to spend that money for the benefit of organizations. So, but donor advised funds are hugely popular.
I think this is really interesting. I think, Paul, it will be really interesting for a lot of the UK, particularly UK and European charities who may be with us today. So I've worked with a US-based donor previously who's given through a DAF, and it was surprisingly easy. All I had to do was register the charity I was working with their provider, which was National Philanthropic Trust, I think was holding her fund. And just to prove we were a charity and a registered charity in the UK, and then the money came in. So
Yeah,
tell us a bit more how that works. You don't have to have any charitable status in the States, do you, to be able to receive that money? So it's a much
you
easier
don't.
yeah.
You, but the holder of the DAF account needs to be able to have the authority to make gifts outside of the United States. That's one of the differences,
Okay.
and so they have to make sure. And I'm not sure that all DAF holders do. I don't think community foundations do. But the big brokerage firms like Charles Schwab and Fidelity, I believe they do. So they need to be able to make gifts to organizations outside the United States.
Mhm.
Um, so it actually is easier. It is easier than setting up a 501(c)(3) friends group, right? Where if you have donors who are giving through their donor advised fund, in fact, it is a fairly easy transaction.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, one of the things that's tricky about donor advised funds too is that, like I said, it's an anonymous event when it happens, when somebody transfers their assets into a donor advised fund. So it's a little bit tricky, right? To ask a donor, like, do you have a donor advised fund? I mean, because they may or may not want to let you know that,
Yeah.
right? Some of them are very forthcoming about the fact that they have a donor advised fund and they're giving through their donor advised fund, but not all are like that.
Yeah. But then I guess
Yeah,
that's for us as kind of fundraising professionals to build those relationships with our donors that we can
that's
have those conversations, isn't it? And
that's exactly right. Yep.
help them work through the best way to make the gifts.
Yep, that's
Okay.
exactly right. Yeah. So plan giving is very much on the rise in the United States, and people and making planned gifts to organizations. Gifts by bequest grew 4.8% between 2022 and 2023. The other thing to remember too is that planned gifts are not just people remembering organizations in their wills. That is one way to make a planned gift,
And
but
I
there are
think
lots of
Paul, this is important because this is the difference between UK and US as well. We would just say legacy giving, and that's a gift in will, but yours is slightly different, isn't it?
Well, ours is slightly different because that is one way, and it actually is probably the most popular way. But there's also vehicles that have been set up that allow a donor to make a planned gift to an organization and then receive life income um, during their lifetime. So, for example, there's a vehicle called a charitable remainder trust, where they take a certain amount of assets out of their estate, they put it into a charitable remainder trust. That trust provides them life income for the rest of their lives, right? And then the corpus of that trust is usually at the end of that person's life transferred to the organization, right? Sometimes there's a primary beneficiary, so it might be transferred to their child before it's transferred to the organization. So it could be years and years before the organization receives the benefit of that planned gift. So stewardship of those planned gifts is really important. There's other vehicles too. There's something called a charitable lead trust. There's, you can actually make a gift of your home and continue to live in your home, but the home is then owned by the charity. So there's, one of the things, I don't know if this happens in the UK, but one of the things that's very popular, particularly in the area of public media in the United States, is people giving their cars. So
Really?
you give your car, yeah, you give your car to the organization. The organization gives it to an auction house to auction. They take the benefit of that, and the donor gets a tax deduction for that. Yeah, lots of public media organizations have car programs, including the ones that we work with. So planned giving is a very specialized field in the United States. There are oftentimes, particularly in large organizations, um, planned giving officers who know the ins and outs of all the planned gifts that are available. There's also we could talk about this. We could do a whole webinar on this of how you count planned gifts. Counting planned gifts is tricky, and how they're held on your balance sheet and all of that. So, as I was talking before, micro gifts, $1 to $100, small gifts, $100 to $500, and mid-sized gifts, $500 to $5,000. That accounts for about 97% of all donors in the United States, and those are declining year after year. Those major gifts, 5,000 to 50,000, and what we call supersized gift, 50,000 or more, are increasing year over year, but by small percentages. And so there you see that impact of the tax code, right? And then the other thing that we're seeing that's really interesting is that online giving. So multi-channel online giving is increasing dramatically. It increased dramatically during the pandemic because we couldn't go see our donors, right? And so it increased dramatically, and then it decreased right after the pandemic, and then it's actually in 2024 it rose to be above pandemic levels. So online giving, multi-channel giving. So multi-channel giving means that it involves email, it involves social media, it involves all kinds of different channels. There are organizations, I don't know if this exists in the UK, but there are organizations, firms in the United States that just deal with multi-channel giving
Yeah.
with organizations. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I think it's partly to do generationally that, younger generations are kind of more au fait with being online. And the pandemic threw us all into an online world, didn't it? So it probably helped create more trust in kind of online giving as well, and putting your details into a platform online than we're perhaps used to as well, didn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Further, you know, a lot of our practice is based on supporting organizations in campaigns. And campaigns, the reason is that campaigns work, right? Campaigns with very specific fundraising priority and asks are very common, and they actually tend to attract the best gifts. What I often say to our clients is that nobody is going to give you their best gift in an annual giving situation. It's just not going to happen, which is why organizations run campaigns and run campaigns that are time limited, that are very specific, that are very impactful. And that's not to say that they shouldn't continue their annual fund gifts, but campaigns work. And it's why organizations are constantly looking to do campaigns. Um, this is happening. This next point is becoming even more and more important, and it's becoming really important, particularly right now in the United States. But engagement and stewardship plays a really vital role in maximizing fundraising success. It is not a set it and forget it kind of transaction that you have with people that are supporting your organizations. You need to engage them. You need to steward that. As I've said to and all of the people who work at CFA are so tired of me saying this, but your well-stewarded gift is your next major gift, right?
We
I
always say
can't
that. We're like, look at your current donors for your next major gift.
totally. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that we've walked into an organization and they said, well, Mrs. Jones made a $1 billion gift to our last campaign. And I'll say, well, what is your relationship with Mrs. Jones? Well, we haven't talked to her in a couple of years.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why not? You know? Um, and as mentioned before, religion, human services, and education are attracting the highest potential of contributions. And I was very happy to see that arts and culture and the environment are also on the ascendancy because those are two of CFA's particular specialties.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what's motivating people to give, right? There's really generational differences. And this is a very hot topic in philanthropy in the United States. So, those Gen Z donors, they want authenticity and transparency. Really important. Millennials, they want impact, convenience, and value alignment. I can't tell you the number. I was at a conference last week, and there was an entire presentation about value alignment with donors.
Really.
Um, yep. Gen Xers, they want to trust the organization. They want organizations to be efficient, and they want to be thanked. And then the boomers, they feel a real sense of duty, of trust, and they also want more recognition than younger generations, right? So integrating these traits in overarching fundraising strategies is really wise, but you have to remember that each generation is not a monolith at all. Um, the best strategy, as always, is to build relationships with your top prospects and learn their specific motivations, right?
It's interesting though, isn't it, how this can feed back what you were saying about institutional culture of philanthropy, that, the comms department has to own this as well and make sure if you are kind of segmenting your comms and you're thinking about how you're pitching that to these different groups, and that a boomer may want to see something completely different than a Gen Z on, the exact same topic. So
Right.
it,
Exactly.
it's so
Yeah.
important, isn't it?
And one of the things too, and I was literally just writing an email earlier this morning to a client about um, in thinking about a case for support, either for your annual giving program or for your campaign program or whatnot, we're seeing that younger generations, while it's really important to have that kind of heartstrings case for support, that kind of institutional, like pull at the heartstrings, this is why the good that we're doing. We're seeing that those younger donors, those sort of Gen Xers and millennials, also really want to see the business case
Mm.
for a campaign. What is the business case? They want to see this in a very practical way. So they want to combine that sort of heartstrings case with the business case, and to really understand that. Older generations are less concerned about that, right? But younger generations really want to understand. Where's their money going? What is the impact it is having? What are you able to do with this money that you cannot do right now? Those kind of conversations are happening a lot. So when we're building cases for campaigns, we're actually having to build in more and more this business case for the campaign.
And it's a
Does that make
valid,
sense?
yeah, absolutely. It's valid because particularly with a capital project, you want to know if you're putting your money into something that actually operationally they can deliver this going forwards, right?
100%. I mean, and we're constantly working with organizations that are doing capital projects, and I'm like, have you operationalized this? Have you figured out once you've built this building or once you've built this wing of your museum or once you've built your new school or whatever, have you figured out operationally if you can actually run it, right? And what is going to be required operationally to run it? Um, because donors want to see that as well. They want to understand that what you're doing is sustainable.
Yeah. Ours is driven partly by the millennium, where there was a big, big fund in the UK, and lots of these really cool projects got money, in the year 2000, and then half of them shut because that hadn't been tested and they couldn't actually, maintain them long term. So super
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. So one of the things that's really gets a lot of attention in the United States is what we call mega gift philanthropy. So um, there was a bit of a downward trend, but in 2024, mega gifts rose by about 33%. When we're talking about mega gifts, we're talking about gifts over $10 million.
Yeah.
So in 2024, there were 319 gifts in the United States over $10 million, amounting to almost $16.2 billion in what we call mega gifts. Now, mega gifts are interesting because they are often announced as, someone's giving $10 million, right? We worked with an organization where we announced a $50 million gift to an organization. But of that $50 million gift, $10 million was cash.
Yeah.
$40 million was a planned gift, right? And so these are often blended gifts, including both a principal gift level and then a bequest from a donor, right? um, and oftentimes these gifts are also, including their ongoing annual giving into with the organization. So, you know, and yes, sometimes these gifts are pure cash. Often these gifts are paid out over a period of 3, 5, 7, sometimes even 10 years.
So
And
in that
so,
scenario, Paul,
yeah,
then let's say you had a fifty million dollar gift and only 10 million was cash. It's towards a capital project and the rest was kind of a planned gift. Can organizations borrow against something like that?
they they can. So you can go to the bank and you can apply for a construction loan or a bridge loan or whatnot, and you can use that signed pledge agreement as collateral. Not valued at 100%. I think they value it at about 80%.
Yeah.
Um, but you can definitely use that as collateral. But the other thing that we then are finding that we need to do with a lot of our clients is actually work with them to like cash flow the campaign. And
Yeah.
we talk to our clients a lot about cash flowing their campaign to understand exactly like, yes, it's great you have a $50 million gift, but what does this mean for actually cash for the organization,
Yeah.
right? Higher education institutions receive the majority of these planned gifts, followed by healthcare institution. But mega gifts to arts and cultural and environmental sector in 2024 were at their highest levels since 2015. The outlier in all of this, of course, is Mackenzie Scott. So Mackenzie Scott, Jeff Bezos's ex-wife, has decided to give away her fortune, and she gives it away in big chunks. Um, I think she's on. I can't remember if it's the fifth or the sixth tranche of these sort of big gifts that are given away.
Wow.
Um, but her giving is so significant in the United States that it's completely skewed all the statistics,
Yeah.
right? So we have a number of clients actually that are recipients of Mackenzie Scott gifts. They're very interesting. You are literally informed one day by a phone call that you're receiving a Mackenzie Scott gift. You are told that you cannot be in touch with the donor. You cannot steward this donor. You cannot have an ongoing relationship with this donor. They're very interesting. But the great thing about them is that they're completely unrestricted.
And you've got $10 million in your bank account that you weren't
And
expecting.
you've got, yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Amazing.
So, more observations. Donors are more diligent. Nonprofits that are transparent and show their impact are better positioned to attract support, right? They want that transparency. They want that honesty. Political polarization and lack of clarity around economic policy, as I mentioned before, is causing just all kinds of uncertainty. We're seeing donors that are holding back. We're seeing donors that are not willing right now to make multi-year commitments to organizations because they don't know what's going to happen in 12 months or 18 months or 24 months. So they'll say, I'll give you a gift now and then come back to me in a year when we know a little bit what's going on,
Yeah.
a little bit more of what's going on. I mean, the fact that in the last 3 days, the United States has essentially entered into conflict into the Middle East is causing, you know, great concern in the United States. I mean, and you wouldn't think it, but things like our immigration policy or our, mass deportations, how is that impacting the workforce? How is that impacting organizations? I mean, donors in the United States right now, I would say, are distracted and concerned, and they're also being bombarded with requests. And so this uncertainty and this polarization is it's causing a fair amount of chaos in the United States. So One of the things just to also be aware of is that the government regulation is definitely impacting cross-border philanthropy. There are rumors of uh, executive orders that are coming out of the White House that is going to limit um, United States donors being able to support organizations abroad. We work with an organization in Hungary, and we also know that the Hungarian government, is also looking to limit the number of organizations outside of Hungary that can actually fund organizations within Hungary. If they're not aligned with the Orban um, political philosophy, they're probably going to be iced out of being able to support those organizations in Hungary. So this is definitely beginning to impact some cross-border philanthropy. The other thing is that, and this is not a surprise to anyone, but technology is completely democratizing giving in the United States, and I think all over the world.
Mm. Interesting stuff.
Yeah.
So some more on the cross-border then. I didn't realize this about the tax deductions with other Canada, Israel, and Mexico.
Yep. So there are exceptions in the United States that if you are an organization in Canada, Israel, or Mexico, and you look like a USA nonprofit, a 501(c)(3), you can make gifts directly to that organization and receive that tax deduction.
Mhm.
But to receive tax deductions, gifts for other nonprofits in other countries, such as the UK, donors can go one of two ways. They can give to a US-based Friends of organization, DAF sponsors with international grant making capabilities, as we discussed, or an intermediary like a CAF America or the American Fund for Charities, right? And we can talk about the pros and cons of that. The other way to do it is to obtain, as I just said, an equivalency determination that certifies a foreign entity is equivalent to a U.S. nonprofit. I've never actually seen that done, but in my research for this webinar, I learned that it can be done. So I
It's
think the most,
possible.
yeah, it is possible. I think the most common, I think the default is let's set up a friends group.
Yeah.
And I think that there's definitely benefits to setting up a friends group. So gifts in a friends group can be accepted from any donor type, from individuals, from foundations, from corporations, from any donor type. They function exactly just like a 501(c)(3) in the United States. Those donations are tax deductible. The other really interesting thing is that friends groups can actually create endowments, and they can manage endowments. Um, and then, friends groups that are really well resourced with either staff or volunteers are really key to that donor stewardship and engagement that happens. One of the things Amy and I have talked about a lot in preparation for this conversation is how hard it is for organizations in the UK or in Europe to actually steward those donors in the United States, right? And how do you compete with that stewardship from local organizations? And so having a really well-resourced friends group, by either having staff in the United States or having really active volunteers in the United States is really key to that stewardship and engagement. Would you agree, Amy?
100%, yeah. And I'd say I know we're going to come on to some challenges of friends groups, but it's really touching again on really important that you think about what is the best vehicle for your organization. So, great example, I was working with an animal charity here in the UK, and we had one major donor, six-figure donor from the States who wanted to give. Um, he could be giving annually, but we knew we weren't going to get loads and loads of donors. So actually setting up a friends of, 501(c)(3) just didn't work for us. It was too much admin. Like you say, we couldn't, manage that entity. And we went down the CAF America route because of the kind of amounts and the relative ease of setting that up in comparison. So it's just so important to make sure it's the right thing for you, isn't it?
Yeah. So some potential challenges, and this is really important, and this is actually embedded into the tax code in the United States, that these friends groups cannot be just seen as pass-throughs. They can't just be seen as we're going to set up a bank account in the United States for people to give money to, get a tax deduction, and then that money transfers automatically to the beneficiary organization in the UK or Europe. They have to be independent organizations. They have independent board of directors. They often have an independent executive director and a board chairman and all of that. They raise money on behalf of the beneficiary organization, but the beneficiary organization has no say whatsoever in how they're raising money, in what they're raising money for, how they're doing it. If they want to, if the Friends Group wants to throw a gala, that's their business. The organization in the UK or Europe cannot say they can and can't do that. They have to operate independently. The other really interesting thing is, and this is applicable to our client in Hungary, is that the beneficiary in Hungary actually has to apply for a grant from the Friends organizations to fund a program in Hungary. So the money isn't just automatically transferred. The board has to make a decision in the US to actually transfer that money to the organization in Hungary. So there's definitely a relationship for sure, but the organization in the UK or Europe cannot just look at this as just a bank account, right? I was noticing again in research for this, I noticed that the La Scala Opera House in Milan has actually set up a brand new friends group. And I was looking at their board, and I thought it was really interesting that the Major Duomo, the executive director of La Scala, actually sits on the board of their friends group. And I thought, well, that's a very interesting loophole, right? That you have management from the organization sitting on the board. Um, one of the challenges we also just mentioned is stewarding and engaging donors without US-based fundraising staff. Now, granted, technology does make that a little bit easier, but and in fact, even like Zoom makes it easier, right, to do that. But I think it's important too that from a programmatic standpoint, I think it's important that there be a programmatic element that happens in the United States that people can actually experience in the United States. So, for example, this orchestra we're working with in Hungary, they do annual concerts in the United States, in New York or in Florida or in Boston or in Chicago or whatnot. So donors actually can see them without having to get on a plane to go to Hungary. Um, you have to comply with annual tax filings at all federal and state levels. Um, and like Amy just referred to, sometimes it's not particularly cost effective if an organization is just starting out and you have no donors, or if you're securing mostly foundation or corporate funds. Because oftentimes foundations and corporations can make gifts in the UK or the United States or in Europe without having to go through the
Yeah.
friends
Yeah.
group, right? But if you have no donors, and if you're just starting out, it might be just better to start out by having those donors give through the CAF or give through another organization until you've built that base of support, right?
Definitely. And I think it's interesting, these challenges of, like you say, of those friends groups having that kind of control over the money. But it's also quite important, isn't it? Because, let's say you've got an organization in Italy and they're fundraising in the States. Those donors in the US have a right to understand where their money's being spent and what's happening to it. And
Totally.
it's that governance procedure, isn't it? So we did exactly the same thing at my elephant charity that I was a trustee of for a while, the sister charity in Thailand, even though we were absolutely on the same page, we knew what we were raising funds for, they made formal grant requests to the UK charity to release money to make sure we were being 100% compliant and, our donors knew exactly that things were being done properly and the money was being spent in the right place. So whilst it can be challenging, it's there for the right reasons, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, some reflections. Now, we've got a couple of questions in the chat, but I have a couple for you first, Paul.
Yeah.
Um, so, how popular is what we would call workplace giving? So, here in the US, we have Give As You Earn, which is kind of payroll giving. So, it gets taken off your salary before kind of your tax is calculated. And it can be a really hard sell here in the UK. What kind of systems do you have in place? And is it something that's popular or not?
It is so. I would say there's a popularity around it for people who are making smaller gifts. So one of the things that many organizations, many companies have set up, including CFA for our employees, is that we have a matching program. So if you make a gift to your favorite organization, you can apply to have your company match that gift up to a certain amount. And oftentimes that match, you know, can exceed $1,000 or $2,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
So matching programs are very popular in the United States, and they are a way for companies to sort of provide that employee benefit, right? Um, One of the things that used to be very popular in the United States, and I think has decreased in popularity, is organizations like the United Way, right? Where um, there would be a United Way campaign within a corporation, and you give to the United Way campaign, and then the United Way then distributes that money to a bunch of different organizations. It used to be seen as a very efficient way for people to make gifts to lots of different kinds of organizations. I think it's waned in popularity because of what we were talking about in terms of people really wanting to understand the impact of their philanthropy
Yeah.
and also wanting to have relationships with the organizations they're supporting. The other thing is that in a United Way campaign, you can sometimes designate your money to go towards certain types of organizations. So there's less control on the donor part in terms of supporting United Way. So the other thing that's also um, fairly popular actually are volunteer programs. So, an organization can go to a bank or to one of the other larger corporations, and they can organize a volunteer force to come out and
Yeah.
support an organization on say it's on a run day or a bike day or planting trees day or a building houses day.
Yeah.
So they can access this sort of large volunteer workforce through relationships that they have, and if you also are an employee that wants to get involved, it's a great way to get involved. Um, a third thing that we also see is there are people within corporations who want to serve on boards, but they don't know sort of how to access serving on boards. So they will often work internally, and there might be a part of the human um, HR department, sorry, HR department that actually works with organizations to place their executives on boards.
Okay.
But it's a less, I would say it's less popular, but it's an important part of the sector, but I don't think it's as popular.
Yeah, a lot of corporates in the UK particularly will do that as well. So give their team corporate volunteering days, so they can choose to go and volunteer at a charity, like you say, planting trees, painting a wall, etc. And it's quite easy for the business because they get their CSR value from that, their corporate social responsibility. But actually, really, it's not costing them the same as it is. Yes, they're still paying their staff member, but making a cash gift. The problem for charities is you've got to find a suitable place to use these volunteers, and not all charities need volunteer time of that kind, do they? So it
That's
can.
right. Yep. Yep.
Right, I do have one more question, but we've got three in the Q&A, so let's go to those first. So make sure these get answered.
Yeah.
So, first of all, from Jack, within environment and animals sector, one could imagine the former category, climate and biodiversity loss, being relatively hard to fundraise for, and the latter, animal welfare, dogs, cats, etc., easier. Do you know the breakdown between those two?
Unfortunately, I don't, Jack, and I'm sorry I don't know the difference between those two. It's very interesting in the United States when, for example, the Nature Conservancy is running a huge global campaign from the United States. And it's huge, it's massive, and are having a lot of success, right? I think that part of the fundraising around environmental causes also has a lot to do with messaging and language because climate change is such a polarizing phrase in the United States. It's such a politically polarizing phrase. But it's interesting that conservation is not a polarizing phrase.
Yeah.
And so, one of the largest groups outside of the Nature Conservancy is an organization in the United States called Ducks Unlimited. And Ducks Unlimited is one of the largest membership conservation organizations in the United States, in fact, maybe in the world. It's mostly hunters that are supporting Ducks Unlimited because they want their wetlands preserved, so they can hunt ducks. Um, so um, so that's and it's interesting to me that the environment is on the ascendancy in terms of where people are supporting, but I don't know the breakdown between the environment and animals. And I can actually go in and look at the data a little bit further, and I'm happy to provide that information afterwards.
It's interesting. We've discussed the differences between fundraising for animals, particularly, haven't we, between UK and US? And actually, it's such a big thing here in the UK. Paul likes to joke that we love a donkey sanctuary over here in
You
Europe.
love a donkey sanctuary. Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but I think it's less prevalent, isn't it, in the States, kind of animal welfare, say your dogs and cats homes, than it is here, from what I've heard from you so far.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
The other question, can a UK charity set up a single USA DAF for multiple donors to give to? No. So that's not how DAFs work. So DAFs are set up by the donors. And the tax event is between the donor and the DAF holder. What a UK charity would do is set up this 501(c)(3) friends group, but not the DAF for multiple donors.
Okay. I've got a
Yeah.
question here from Carl, who's actually one of my former clients at here in the UK, who had just come into the end of a massive capital project. So they work with the British Schools and Universities Foundation, which we discussed earlier, Paul, which um, channels those gifts as a 501(c)(3) from American donors. But Carl's saying it can take some time to funds to arrive with us, as they're not the initial donor, and it has to kind of be channeled through. They've explored other avenues, but what would your be recommendation for irregular one-off major donors from US donors?
I mean, that's a very good question. I don't know that I have an answer to that question in terms of like expediency, right? Just because of the bureaucracy that is involved.
Mm.
I would say, you know, um, wouldn't you say it would be Calf America or something
For
equivalent to
me and
that?
my experience, I'd go with CAF. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
You do have that paperwork, obviously, of getting set up, but once that's done, it is a very efficient tool, I found.
yeah,
Thanks for
yeah,
that, Carl. Mark's
yeah.
asking, can you recap the way to get noticed by DAFs with minimal investment? Is this possible?
Very hard. Because as I said before, the DAFs are an anonymous event that happens between the donor and the DAF holder. And so it's hard to actually cultivate DAF holders. And US charities struggle with that all the time. Um, and sometimes it is important, for example, if the DAF is being held by a community foundation, it is possible to engage with that community foundation. And the community foundation then can communicate with the DAF holders about the needs of the certain organization. So we've worked with a couple of community foundations where every year they actually publish a book of like, these are all of the organizations that have approached us. We can't fund them. Might you be interested in funding them through your DAF, something like that? Um, but it is definitely a challenge.
Challenge. Okay. And I think here's one I can answer. Megan's asking if there's any central databases or resources for US funding. So here in the UK, Paul, we have specific kind of um, database you pay a fee for that you can look for grant makers and what have you. We actually use Megan Foundation Centre Online, we find is a great one. Do you have any other recommendations, Paul?
Foundation Center Online,
Yeah. Okay.
for
So that's
sure.
the one to go to, Megan.
Yeah, we use that frequently. Foundation Center Online too, and also there's a owned by the same company called Candid. They have something um, that allows you to look up organizations, right? And look at what are called their 990s, which are their tax forms, to see the size of their budget, how much money they're raising, all of that. It gives you a little bit more insight into the organization, and that's called GuideStar.
Fantastic. I realised we
Yeah.
weren't on my questions slide, Paul. We've got 2 minutes left, so let's just squeeze in the last one.
There's
From
also another question in the
Oh, we've had
chat.
another one.
Just
Okay, let's do that
yeah.
first. Hang on. Are UK-based Americans a good route to reaching more US donors, and what would be a good approach to doing this?
I absolutely think they probably are, right? I think UK-based Americans have networks in the United States, and I think that engaging with UK-based Americans is a great idea. Would you say so, Amy?
Absolutely. Yeah. Fundraising is about networks, isn't it?
Yeah.
regardless of where you are. So if you have somebody who is UK based but does, return to the States and has networks there, then yes, absolutely explore those.
Yeah. When I was a gift officer at Columbia University, one of our campaign cabinet members was American, but lived in the UK, lived in London, ran a brokerage firm in London. So he had not only a London network, but he also had a very vast US network that was based on his alumni association, on private clubs that he belonged to, on, other business contacts. So he was a great um, advocate for the campaign, um, because of his, he sort of had a foot in both worlds. So for sure.
So Emma's then following up on that, Paul, and saying, what about UK donors, for example, alumni based in the US? How best to use them?
I would say, depending on their level of engagement or what they want to be engaged, one is that they could sit on the board of the American Friends Group, and be involved in that way, or they can access their networks. If they don't want a board responsibility, they can access their networks in the United States, and they can be a very powerful advocate and ambassador for your organization in the United States. They can host events, they can, do what it is, but they can be your advocate and ambassador and connection to the United States for sure. Very important, though, that they also be donors to your organization,
Definitely.
because then they have some skin in the game, right? They have a stake in that.
Definitely. Our golden rule is don't ask others to do what you're not prepared to do yourself. So
Yeah, exactly.
so yeah, whatever the situation of these networks are always a win, aren't they? They always keep us growing our donor pools. So fantastic. Okay, time's up on today's webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Our contact details are here. If you have any questions, any follow-up, reach out. Paul and I'd be happy to have a chat to you. Like I say, this is recorded and will be on both of our websites. And we're going to have lots of other stuff going on this year, Paul, with our partnership, aren't we? Discussing
We
all.
are, and I was actually going to go off script a little bit and say if people have ideas about webinars in the future or topics that you would like us to discuss in specific webinars, like the culture of philanthropy or whatnot, email one or the both of us, and we would love to consider those as well.
Absolutely. Yes, we want to be talking about subjects that you guys want to learn about, don't we? So I think,
Definitely.
uh, Keith, please send out the slides. Yeah, like I say, Keith, they'll be available online after the webinar, so no problem with
All
that.
right.
Well, thank you so
Thanks,
much,
everybody.
everyone.
Yes.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.